In the summer of 2004, the United States Army was losing soldiers at a rate no one in the Pentagon had planned for. Not to enemy armor, not to artillery, to holes in the ground. 155 American soldiers were killed inside high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles that year alone. 1 year, one vehicle type, 155 names added to a list that kept growing every week the war continued. The weapon killing them was not sophisticated. A 155mm artillery shell, the kind left behind in Iraqi ammunition depots that had been abandoned, unsecured, in the chaos of the 2003 invasion. A pressure plate or a wire, run to a garage door opener purchased at a local market, buried 14 inches beneath the surface of a road. Waiting. The blast came from below, directed upward through the one surface of the vehicle that offered the least protection, the floor. Here is what made that fact impossible to explain in a congressional hearing. The United States Army had 140,000 of these vehicles in its inventory. It had spent $3.4 billion acquiring them over 2 decades. It had exported them to 50 allied nations on every continent. It had reorganized its entire ground mobility doctrine around them. And in the summer of 2004, American soldiers in Iraq were driving to war with scrap metal bolted to their doors. Steel salvaged from Iraqi junkyards, welded on by unit mechanics working overnight. Because the Army had no better answer to give them. Congress called hearings. The Secretary of Defense flew to Kuwait to face the troops. The question from the floor was direct. Why are soldiers going to war in vehicles that cannot protect them? The answer, when it finally came, was institutional. The Humvee had not been designed for this. It had never been designed for this. It had been built for a different war. A war fought on the open plains of Central Europe against a Soviet enemy that had ceased to exist 15 years before the first IED was buried in Anbar province. But the real story of the HMWV is not the ambush en route Tampa, or the hearing room in Washington, or the scrap metal welded to the doors. It is the story of a vehicle that defined American military power for a generation. Built for one kind of war, deployed in every other kind. And what happens when the gap between design intent and battlefield reality becomes too wide to close with armor plate and good intentions? Every week, we tell the stories behind the weapons, the programs, and the decisions that shaped American military power. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in South Bend, Indiana, in 1979. By the late 1970s, the United States Army had a problem it could no longer defer. The vehicle fleet moving its soldiers across every theater. The M151 quarter-ton utility truck. The M561 Gamma Goat. The aging Jeep derivatives that had evolved without fundamental redesign since the Korean War, had fractured into 11 separate light vehicle types. 11 different logistics tails, 11 different parts inventories, 11 different maintenance training pipelines feeding 11 different sets of technical manuals. In peacetime, that fragmentation was manageable. In a NATO war against the Warsaw Pact in Central Europe, where resupply chains would be stretched hundreds of miles, where logistics speed would determine whether American forces held the Fulda Gap or lost it in the first 72 hours. That fragmentation was not an inconvenience. It was a strategic liability written into every motor pool on the continent. The Army's Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC, formalized the problem in 1977. What the service needed was a single, unified light tactical vehicle capable of replacing all 11 types simultaneously. Not a compromise between them. Not a vehicle that split the difference and served none of the missions well. A replacement that exceeded every one of them, a single chassis that could carry soldiers, tow artillery, mount crew-served weapons, function as a battlefield ambulance, serve as a command and communications platform, and haul cargo across the same terrain, in the same conditions, on the same operational day. In 1979, TRADOC translated that requirement into a formal program specification. The document asked for something the automotive engineering community read with quiet skepticism. The vehicle had to carry a payload of 2,500 pounds. It had to ford standing water 60 inches deep without preparation or waterproofing kits. It had to climb a 60% grade, a slope steep enough that standing on it requires holding onto something. It had to reach 65 miles per hour on paved road. And it had to accomplish all of this at a unit cost target that would allow the Army to buy it in the tens of thousands. 3 contractors submitted proposals. AM General Corporation, headquartered in South Bend, Indiana, a company that traced its direct lineage to the Kaiser Jeep Corporation and before that to American Motors, entered the competition alongside Teledyne Continental Motors and Chrysler Defense. The structure of the competition was an engineering and manufacturing development contract. Each bidder would design and deliver working prototypes for government evaluation at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Total development funding allocated to each contractor for initial design work, approximately $1.2 million. The full production contract, worth $168 million to the winner, would follow the evaluation. Chrysler Defense was not a weak competitor. The company had won the M1 Abrams main battle tank contract in 1976 and was, at that moment, one of the dominant forces in American ground vehicle procurement. Teledyne Continental had deep expertise in military drivetrain and engine systems. AM General was the smallest of the 3, the least prominent, and the one with the most to gain. AM General's engineering team recognized something in the TRADOC specification that would determine the outcome of the competition before a single prototype turned a wheel. The document did not describe a vehicle. It described a family of vehicles, 15 distinct configurations sharing a common chassis, a common drivetrain, a common suspension architecture, a common set of maintenance procedures. The modularity was not a secondary feature. It was the entire point of the program. The contractor who solved the platform problem, who built a chassis capable of supporting every variant the Army would ever need, without compromise in any of them, would not win one contract. That contractor would win the right to manufacture American ground mobility for the next generation. AM General chose to solve the platform problem first. The variants could follow. In 1980, the company delivered its first prototypes to Aberdeen Proving Ground. The vehicle that arrived on the evaluation pad was wider than anything the Army had tested before. 85 inches across the body, low slung. With a silhouette that looked nothing like the Jeep derivatives it was built to replace. It cleared a 22-inch vertical obstacle. It operated without mechanical failure at temperatures ranging from minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit to plus 125 degrees. It demonstrated the 60% grade climb the specification demanded on loose gravel, without hesitation. The width, 85 inches, was not a styling decision. It was the geometric consequence of every engineering choice the team had made. The geared hub reduction axles that pushed ground clearance to 16 inches, the independent suspension at all 4 corners, the low center of gravity that kept the vehicle planted on severe lateral slopes. Every dimension was a trade-off made deliberately. AM General had made each one in full awareness of what it cost and what it bought. The evaluation results were unambiguous. The competition was over before most people outside the program knew it had begun. On January 22, 1983, The United States Army awarded AM General Corporation the production contract for the High Mobility Multipurpose Wheeled Vehicle. The contract was worth $1.2 billion. The initial order covered 55,000 vehicles across 15 distinct variants. Chrysler Defense received nothing. Teledyne Continental received nothing. AM General had taken the field, and it had taken it completely. What the Army purchased that January was not simply a vehicle. It had purchased an architecture, a platform designed from the ground up to be reconfigured, remounted, and redeployed across every mission the light force would ever face. Understanding why that architecture worked requires understanding the single engineering decision that made everything else possible. The central innovation of the HMMWV was the geared hub reduction axle. In a conventional vehicle, the final drive reduction gear, the component that converts the rotational speed of the drive shaft into the slower, more powerful rotation of the wheel, sits at the center of the axle housing, as low to the ground as the geometry of the wheel itself allows. In the HMMWV, that final reduction gear was relocated outward into a separate planetary gear set housed inside each individual wheel hub. The axle shafts connecting the differential to the wheels could therefore run significantly higher, nearly 16 inches above the ground, while the wheel and tire assembly still extended downward to contact the surface normally. The practical consequence of that single relocation was 16 inches of ground clearance under the differential, nearly double what the M151 Jeep had offered. The vehicle could roll across terrain that stopped conventional trucks, not because its tires were larger or its suspension softer, but because the geometry of its drivetrain had been reconceived from the center outward. Rocks, debris, and rutted ground that would have contacted the axle housing of any other vehicle passed harmlessly beneath it. The engine driving that system was a 6.2-liter General Motors diesel V8, producing 150 horsepower, connected to a 3-speed automatic transmission and a 2-speed transfer case. Four-wheel drive was permanent. There was no two-wheel drive mode, no selector lever, no decision required from the driver. All four wheels received power at all times, in all conditions, on all surfaces. The vehicle was always prepared for the worst terrain it might encounter, because it was always configured for it. The suspension used double A-arm geometry at all four corners, the same basic configuration found in performance road cars, selected here not for handling refinement, but for maximum independent wheel travel. When the left front wheel dropped into a shell crater or a drainage ditch, the other three wheels remained in contact with the ground. The vehicle did not tilt dramatically. It did not lose traction on the opposite axle. It adapted to the surface beneath it and kept moving. At 85 inches wide, the HMWV was broader than a standard traffic lane in most American cities. In 1983, that fact existed entirely in the abstract. The vehicle had been specified for open terrain, the agricultural plains of West Germany, the gravel flats of the Mojave, the sand and hardpan of the Middle East that Cold War planners had studied but not yet named as a theater. Urban counterinsurgency was not in the requirement document. It was not an Army doctrine. It would not enter the operational conversation for 2 decades. That width would eventually define the vehicle's role in wars no one in South Bend had anticipated. But that reckoning was still years away. The Army organized initial HMWV fielding around its most critical formations. The 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the Army's premier rapid deployment force, capable of putting boots on the ground anywhere in the world within 18 hours. The 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the air assault force built around helicopter-delivered infantry and the vehicles that would support them on the ground. The 1st Armored Division stationed in West Germany, forward deployed NATO armor, whose entire operational concept depended on the ability to move fast, resupply faster, and sustain the fight without breaking the logistics chain. 15 variants entered service simultaneously. The M998 was the baseline cargo and troop carrier, the vehicle that would become the most recognizable silhouette in American military history. The M1025 and M1026 were armament carriers, fitted with a roof-mounted ring for crew-served weapons. The M997 was a 4-liter ambulance capable of carrying 4 stretcher patients across terrain that would stop a conventional ambulance cold. The M1037 and M1042 were shelter carriers, designed to mount SINCGARS radio systems, tow anti-tank missile racks, and sensor packages that turned the basic chassis into a mobile command post. The M1097, the heavy Hummer, carried a higher payload rating for equipment loads that exceeded the standard vehicle's capacity. Every variant shared the same chassis, the same drivetrain, the same suspension geometry, the same maintenance manual for 80% of its components. A mechanic trained on the M998 could work on the M1097 without retraining. A spare parts shipment destined for a cavalry unit could support a signal battalion operating in the same theater. The logistical promise AM General had made in South Bend had been delivered in hardware, in 15 configurations, simultaneously. The unit cost at initial production was $23,000 per vehicle. By the end of the Gulf War procurement cycle, that figure had risen to approximately $46,000, reflecting armament packages, communications equipment, and mission-specific add-ons, not base vehicle cost growth. The program that had entered production at $1.2 billion for 55,000 vehicles was, by 1991, a $4.5 billion enterprise and still expanding. The decision had been made. The program had its champion. And the United States Army was about to take the HMWV into a war that would define its reputation and begin to reveal its limits in front of the entire world. When the first American ground forces crossed the border into Kuwait on February 24, 1991, the HMWV was everywhere. Operation Desert Storm deployed approximately 28,000 HMWVs to the Gulf Theater, the largest single-theater concentration of the vehicle in the program's history to that point. Every major Army formation moved on Humvees or depended on them for its support structure. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, drove its HMWVs through the breached Iraqi defensive lines in the opening hours of the ground war. The 3rd Armored Division executed its flanking movement across the desert floor with Humvee-mounted scouts ranging ahead of the tank columns. The 24th Infantry Division made its deep thrust into southern Iraq, cutting off the Republican Guard's line of retreat. With HMMWVs carrying the commanders, the communications gear, and the forward observers who called in the airstrikes that made the advance possible. The 101st Airborne Division launched the largest air assault operation in history at the Euphrates River Valley, and when its soldiers hit the ground, Humvees were among the first vehicles off the helicopters. The Marine Corps operated its own fleet, purchased independently on the same chassis. Special Operations Forces ran stripped-down variants deep into the Iraqi rear area, mounted with heavy machine guns and anti-tank missiles, operating for days without resupply. In 100 hours of ground combat, the HMMWV performed exactly the mission it had been designed and procured to perform. The terrain was open and firm. Engagement distances were long. Iraqi air defenses had been systematically dismantled by 6 weeks of coalition air power before a single American soldier crossed the border. The vehicle moved at speed across the desert floor, hauled ammunition forward, linked ground units to the communications architecture managing the theater, and mounted crew-served weapons that gave light infantry formations a direct fire capability they had never possessed at that scale. The after-action assessments were unambiguous. The vehicle had performed. The logistics tale had held. The modularity that AM General had promised in a conference room in South Bend in 1979 had delivered in practice, under combat conditions, across an entire theater of operations. Desert Storm made the HMMWV famous in a way that no procurement document or Army field manual ever could. The images broadcast from the Gulf. Humvees rolling across the Saudi desert in columns that stretched to the horizon. Ring-mounted machine guns silhouetted against the burning oil fields of Kuwait. Entered American popular consciousness as the definitive image of American military power at the end of the Cold War. General Motors recognized the opportunity. In 1992, the company negotiated a licensing agreement with AM General to produce a civilian derivative. The vehicle that reached American dealerships as the Hummer H1 was the direct commercial descendant of the M998. Same basic architecture, same geared hub axles, same imposing width. At its peak in 2006, GM was selling approximately 71,000 Hummer-branded vehicles per year across the H1, H2, and H3 model lines. But Desert Storm had obscured something important. And the obscuring was not accidental. The Gulf War was an exceptional battlefield. One where American technology, doctrine, and air power combined to create conditions the Army had spent 4 decades optimizing for. The HMWV had not been tested in its worst environment. It had been tested in its best one. The threat it had been designed to survive, the conventional Soviet ground assault across the North German plain, had never materialized. The threat it had not been designed to survive was still 2 years away in a city on the East African coast that most Americans could not have located on a map. On October 3, 1993, a pair of MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down over the Bakara market district of Mogadishu, Somalia. The soldiers aboard and around the crash sites needed to be extracted. The vehicles sent to reach them were HMMWVs. What followed over the next 17 hours would become one of the most studied small unit engagements in American military history. The quick reaction force driving toward the first crash site moved through streets that were narrow enough to force single-file movement, flanked by buildings from which Somali militia fired AK-47S and RPG-7S at ranges measured in feet, not yards. The HMMWV's ring-mounted machine guns were effective at suppressing fire from the front and the flanks. The gunners operating them were completely exposed from the waist up. There was no overhead protection. There was no side protection above the door line. The vehicle's profile, low, wide, fast, had been optimized for open terrain and long sight lines. In the warrens of Bakara Market, those qualities were irrelevant. What mattered was what the vehicle could absorb. And what it could absorb in that environment was not enough. Several HMWVs in the rescue column were disabled by RPG strikes to the engine compartment and wheel assemblies. 18 American soldiers were killed before the battle ended. 73 were wounded. The images that reached American television, a soldier's body dragged through Mogadishu's streets, ended the mission and reshaped American foreign policy for the remainder of the decade. The Army drew conclusions from Mogadishu. The conclusions were correct as far as they went. The HMWV required better protection in urban environments. The service began developing add-on armor packages. Bolt-on steel plate that could be affixed to the doors, the lower body panels, and the undercarriage in theater. The A-Kit armor package added approximately 1,000 pounds to the vehicle's curb weight. The more comprehensive B-Kit added nearly 3,500 pounds on a vehicle with a gross vehicle weight rating of 7,700 pounds. The suspension geometry, the brake system, the drivetrain, none of them had been engineered for that load. At full B-kit weight, the HMMWV's off-road performance degraded measurably. Its top speed dropped. Its fuel consumption rose. Its suspension components wore at accelerated rates. The add-on armor did not transform the vehicle into something it was not designed to be. It made the vehicle heavier, slower, harder to maintain, and marginally better protected, while leaving the floor, the most vulnerable surface against the threat that was coming, largely unchanged. The Army's institutional response was adaptation rather than replacement. Through the mid-1990s, the service invested in armor development programs and began procuring limited numbers of the M1114, an up-armored HMWV variant built on a reinforced frame with a higher payload rating, factory-installed armored doors, and a blast-resistant floor pan that offered meaningfully better protection than the standard vehicle. The M1114 was a genuine engineering improvement. It was also expensive relative to the base vehicle, and it was procured in numbers that reflected a peacetime budget environment, not a combat emergency. The Balkans deployments of the mid to late 1990s, Bosnia under I4 and SFOR beginning in 1995, Kosovo under KFOR beginning in 1999, placed HMMWVs in peacekeeping roles across terrain and urban environments where mines and improvised devices remained persistent threats. The lessons continued to accumulate in after-action reports that moved through the Army's lessons learned system. They did not yet produce a replacement program. They did not yet produce an emergency procurement request. The institutional assumption held. The HMWV, properly armored and properly employed, was adequate for the missions the Army expected to face. That assumption was still intact on September 10, 2001. The following morning, everything the Army thought it knew about the next war was rendered obsolete before the dust had settled in lower Manhattan. Within weeks, the first American soldiers were moving into Afghanistan. Within months, HMWVs were crossing the Hindu Kush. Within 2 years, they were rolling through the streets of Baghdad, Fallujah, Ramadi, and Mosul, cities the vehicle had never been designed to enter, against a threat it had never been designed to survive. The war the Army had prepared for had never come. The war it got was already here. In 2004, the IED became the defining tactical reality of the American war in Iraq. Not the rocket-propelled grenade, not the vehicle-borne bomb detonated in a marketplace. The buried device, patient, invisible, triggered by a pressure plate or a command wire run to a position 300 meters away, placed beneath the surface of the road that the HMWV's wheels would cross at speed every day on every route in every province. The geometry of the attack was precise. An IED detonating beneath a vehicle directs the majority of its energy upward, into the structure directly above the blast point. In a V-hull vehicle, a design in which the floor of the crew compartment is angled downward from the center line toward the sides, like the keel of a ship, that energy is redirected outward and away from the occupants. The physics of the V-hull had been understood since South African engineers developed the Caspier and the Buffle for counterinsurgency operations in Namibia and Angola in the 1970s. The geometry worked. It had been proven in combat over 2 decades before the first American soldier deployed to Iraq. The HMWV did not have a V-hull. It had a flat floor. The energy of a buried IED detonating beneath the vehicle transferred directly upward into the crew compartment through the least protected surface of the entire structure. The M1114's reinforced floor pan offered improvement over the standard vehicle. It was not a solution to the physics of the problem. It was a mitigation, and a partial one. Here was the arithmetic of the crisis. In 2003, When the invasion of Iraq began, the Army had deployed fewer than 300 1,114 up-armored HMMWVs to the theater. The total HMWV inventory across the U.S. military at that time stood at approximately 235,000 vehicles. The M1114 represented something close to 0.1% of the fleet. The remaining vehicles, the M998S, the M1025S, the M1097S, the entire procurement legacy of 2 decades and $3.4 billion, went to war with floors that the enemy had already figured out how to defeat. The congressional hearings that began in 2004 produced a moment that defined the political crisis more precisely than any budget document or procurement report. In December of that year, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld traveled to Kuwait to address a formation of soldiers preparing to deploy into Iraq. A soldier from the Tennessee National Guard, Specialist Thomas Wilson, rose during the question period and asked directly why his unit was being forced to dig through landfills for scrap metal to bolt onto their vehicles before crossing the border. The question was not rhetorical. The answer Rumsfeld gave, recorded on camera, broadcast across every network in the country, was institutional in its honesty and devastating in its implications. "You go to war with the army you have," he said, "not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time." The Army had 235,000 Humvees. It did not have a replacement. It did not have a program in production that could fill the gap. What it had was a production line in South Bend, Indiana, still building more of the same vehicle. Because the program that would eventually replace the HMWV was not a vehicle. It was a requirement document. And requirement documents do not stop IEDs. The institutional acknowledgement that the HMWV could not be armor packaged into adequacy came in the form of a program the Pentagon had resisted funding for years before the Iraq crisis made resistance politically impossible. The Mine-Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle, the MRAP, was not a new idea in 2004. The V-hull design concept had existed in American military literature since the 1990s. A Marine Corps study completed in 2000 had specifically recommended procuring V-hull protected vehicles for operations in threat environments where buried IEDs were a primary risk. The study was filed. The funding was not allocated. The HMWV fleet was large, it was paid for, and the doctrine that governed its employment had not yet been rewritten by the arithmetic of casualties. By 2006, that arithmetic could no longer be managed administratively. IED strikes were accounting for the majority of American combat deaths in Iraq. The data on M1114 survivability versus standard HMWV survivability in IED strikes was unambiguous in classified Army reporting. A gap wide enough that the question of why the entire deployed fleet had not been converted to protected vehicles was being asked not just in congressional hearings, but inside the Pentagon itself. In 2007, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates designated the MRAP program a Department of Defense acquisition priority, the highest designation available in the procurement system, one that authorized bypassing the normal requirements validation and competitive evaluation timelines that typically stretched programs across years before a single vehicle reached a soldier. Multiple manufacturers received concurrent contracts. Force Protection Industries, BAE Systems, Oshkosh Corporation, Navistar Defense, and International Military and Government all entered production simultaneously. The government paid premium prices to compress delivery schedules. Approximately 27,000 MRAP vehicles reached American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. The total program cost was approximately $45 billion. $45 billion, the price of the gap between what the HMWV had been designed to survive and what the wars of the first decade of the 21st century actually required. The Joint Light Tactical Vehicle Program, the JLTV, had been in conceptual development since the late 1990s. Its requirements shaped directly by the lessons of Mogadishu and refined by everything the Army learned in Iraq. 3 contractors competed for the engineering and manufacturing development contract. AM General, seeking to retain the ground mobility franchise it had held since 1983. Lockheed Martin, and Oshkosh Defense. In August 2015, the Army awarded the low-rate initial production contract to Oshkosh Defense. The contract was worth $6.75 billion for approximately 17,000 vehicles. AM General protested the award. The Government Accountability Office denied the protest in January 2016. The company that had built 280,000 HMWVs for the American military over 3 decades had lost the contract to replace its own vehicle. South Bend began winding down primary U.S. military production. Export orders for allied nations kept the lines running at reduced tempo. The National Guard retained its Humvees, but the frontline army was moving on. The last combat brigade completed its conversion to the JLTV in 2021. 38 years, 280,000 vehicles, 1 franchise, gone. Not in a single congressional vote, not in a single secretary's memo, but 1 unit at a time, 1 conversion cycle at a time, until the vehicle that had defined American ground mobility for a generation was no longer the vehicle any frontline American soldier would drive to war. The program didn't end loudly. It ended the way most things end in the procurement world. Quietly, on a spreadsheet, with a delivery receipt. What the HMWV left behind is not a matter of sentiment. It is a matter of engineering record, procurement history, and doctrinal consequence. And those 3 ledgers do not always agree with each other. On the engineering ledger, the verdict is straightforward. The geared hub reduction axle that AM General developed for the HMWV program became the baseline design reference for subsequent American light tactical vehicles. Oshkosh Defense's JLTV, the vehicle that won the contract AM General lost, employs an independent suspension architecture with hub reduction geometry that traces its conceptual lineage directly to what AM General's engineers built in South Bend in 1980. The vehicle that displaced the Humvee carries the Humvee's most important mechanical idea inside its wheel hubs. In that specific and measurable sense, the HMMWV did not end. It evolved into its own replacement. On the doctrinal ledger, the accounting is more complicated and more costly. The GAO report published in 2007, GAO 07509, a document that examined the MRAP acquisition in the context of the Army's earlier decisions about HMWV protection, noted that the Army had received documented warnings about the IED vulnerability of its light vehicle fleet beginning in 2003. The first year of the Iraq occupation. Those warnings had produced add-on armor programs. They had not produced emergency replacement procurement. They had not produced an accelerated MRAP fielding initiative. The institutional response, across 2 administrations and 4 budget cycles, had been to modify the existing vehicle, rather than to acknowledge that the existing vehicle represented a fundamentally different design solution to a fundamentally different threat environment. The GAO's conclusion was precise and unsparing. The Army had suffered from a systemic failure of requirements adaptation, an organizational assumption embedded deeply enough to survive multiple warning signals, that a vehicle designed for one threat environment could be incrementally modified to survive a different one. That assumption was wrong. It had been wrong since the first IED killed a soldier in an unprotected HMWV in 2003. And the price of that assumption when finally calculated in a procurement line item, was $45 billion. That figure reshaped American military vehicle acquisition policy in ways still visible in every program that followed. The JLTV requirement, written after the MRAP experience had been fully absorbed, mandated blast protection equivalent to the MRAP category from the ground up, as a baseline specification, not as an add-on option. The Joint Requirements Oversight Council established new protection standards for all future light tactical vehicle programs. The lesson the HMWV's vulnerability had taught was institutionalized into the specifications that govern what the Army buys next. The Humvee shaped American military doctrine not only in what it enabled, but in what it failed to prevent. The human footnote to the program belongs to James Hagan, AM General's president during the critical years of the 1983 contract award and the early production expansion. Hagan had built his career through the Kaiser Jeep lineage, and he oversaw AM General's transformation from a secondary defense vehicle manufacturer into the central supplier of American ground mobility. He departed the company in 1995. 2 years before the after-action reports from Mogadishu began accumulating seriously enough to prompt institutional questions about the HMWV's long-term adequacy in urban threat environments. Whether a different leadership calculus in the years that followed might have accelerated the Army's recognition of the hour when the vehicle's limits is a question the historical record cannot answer. What the record does show is that the window between the Somalia warning and the Iraq crisis, 8 years, 2 administrations, multiple budget cycles, was long enough that the answer did not have to cost what it ultimately cost. The honest verdict on the HMWV is this: it was the right vehicle for the war it was designed to fight. It was procured in numbers that reflected genuine operational need. It was fielded with a logistics and maintenance architecture that functioned as designed. Its modularity delivered exactly what AM General promised and exactly what TRADOC required. Against the threat environment of a NATO conventional war in Germany or a desert campaign like Desert Storm, it would have served its entire operational life without fundamental criticism. The problem was never the vehicle. The problem was the doctrine that assumed the vehicle would always fight in the conditions for which it had been designed, and the institutional inertia that made correcting that assumption slower than the battlefield could wait. If you found this history valuable, give the video a like. It is the single best signal you can send this channel. And if you want more stories about the weapons programs and the decisions that shaped American military power, subscribe to Defense Archive. We will see you in the next one. Somewhere north of Mosul, in the summer of 2004, a convoy of M998 HMWVs rolled through ground that had been swept for IEDs 3 hours before. The sweep had missed one. The lead vehicle crossed it at 35 miles per hour. The blast lifted the chassis 18 inches off the road's surface, blew the doors clear of their hinges, and killed 2 of the 4 soldiers inside. In a vehicle that had crossed the Rhine on NATO exercises, the Saudi border in Desert Storm, and the streets of Panama City in the rain, before the dust had settled enough for the vehicles behind it to stop.